nature of the wartime Soviet economy. The heroism and sacrifices by the Red Army and the Soviet citizens helped to grind down the German advance. However, it was the Soviet economy which paved the way to this victory. The USSR greatly outproduced its enemy and had prepared itself with investments in steel machinery, chemicals, and the power to produce weapons and munitions. One of the problems that evidence suggests is that the Soviet economy was not fully geared towards war needs. The regime did not ensure that war industry was located away from the vulnerable western regions where the Germans were invading. By November 1941, the Germans occupied an area of 2/3 of the Soviet population and 1/3 of its labour force, as well as well over half of its big industries and industrial capacity. The USSR evacuated some industrial equipment from the German advance from June 1941. This was seen as a great and decisive achievement. However, a more balanced assessment is that although helpful for eventual victory, this contribution has been exaggerated. Soviet assumptions that any future wars would be fought on foreign lands meant that there was no coordinated relocation plan. Although there was some successfully relocated industry, much was left too late or not relocated to a safe enough distance. By 1942, production of key resources like coal, steel and oil were down. Productivity in areas where industry was relocated was relatively low due to the strain on communications and basic services. There was a serious economic crisis in 1942. At the end of 1942, Soviet productive capacity was only 68% of pre-war capacity. Agriculture also suffered badly, as Soviet historians accepted, although they disagree on the impact on production. Another major problem was the shortage of labour. This had been an issue before the war because the Soviet economy was very labour-intensive, with no spare capacity even before 1941. By 1942, the USSR had mobilised virtually all possible labour resources, to the extent that if more labour was required for one enterprise or sector, it could only be found by transferring it from another sector, which was also regarded as essential. There is a real possibility that it would become impossible to replace equipment needed by the armed forces. By the end of the first fortnight of the war, there were already 10 million Soviet citizens in the armed forces. There were simply too few people to go around. The economy was therefore strained almost to breaking point, simply papering over the cracks. Soviet workers, who included children and old people, worked long hours in difficult conditions. The Soviet workforce. The USSR was already fully mobilised for war by 1942, and indeed almost at breaking point. It is possible to talk of the USSR experiencing total war in a meaningful sense. There was certainly no respite. For example, when in 1941 and 1942 particular areas were under threat of German attack, workers volunteered or were forced to march out of their factories and join Soviet soldiers in the fighting. Often untrained and poorly equipped, these workers suffered great losses, and then there's the added problem of how they were to be replaced, even if the German attack was repulsed. To coordinate this problem of mobilising the workforce, a Labour Committee was set up at the beginning of the war. Management of the workforce became even more systematic later in 1941 and 1942. This was necessary to prevent anomalies that arose early in the war, for example when workers essential for war found themselves conscripted into the armed forces. However, it was not until November 1942 that the Labour Committee acquired sufficient authority to prevent various agencies poaching labour for their own needs from elsewhere. Only then was wartime economy and in particular the management and allocation of labour effectively coordinated.